Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
I'm so glad you're joining me for this episode of Street Soldiers on hunger, housing, and hope. As millions of people in the United States face the daily challenge of not having enough to eat, a new president and his administration are vowing to bring relief. But can it come fast enough? The most recent U.S. Census survey found that 25% of Americans are experiencing housing insecurity, meaning they could not make the previous month's rent or mortgage payment and have no way to pay the current one. The housing issue is a top priority for Assemblymember Zoran Mamdani.
We're in the midst of a pandemic where the medical advice for people was to stay home, and yet we are making it economically impossible for many people to do just that. We are saying that, yes, you may have lost your job. Yes, you need to stay home to stay healthy. But in fact, we still need you to pay rent.
Long lines outside food pantries are now common sights. In many cases, it's the first time in their lives these men and women have had to accept a helping hand to make sure they can feed their families and themselves. Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez Rojas volunteers weekly at the Love Wins food pantry.
These are people who work every day and contribute to this society, and we have failed them. We have failed them, and it breaks my heart that that is the position that they're in, to sit and wait hours and hours and hours on food line just to make sure they could put a meal on their table.
The unprecedented unity of voting groups that came together to put Joe Biden in the White House is an encouraging sign, says Washington Post political reporter Eugene Scott. He notes they crossed various demographic lines and spanned generations to vote for change, many for the first time.
We have an engaged electorate. We have a population that really cares about the policies that are going to affect them and wants to get behind policymakers that they believe have their best interests in mind. And so that level of engagement gives me hope. And that's exciting to see people just give, a care, should I say.
Joining me for this conversation is Jessica Gonzalez Rojas. She's the first Latina, first person of color elected to the New York State Assembly from Jackson Heights and other neighborhoods in Queens. Jessica, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Also with us is Zoran Mamdani. He is the first South Asian man elected to the New York State Assembly, first South Asian man elected, period, from New York City to anything. Zoran, great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Eugene Scott. He's a political reporter for the Washington Post and host of the new podcast, The Next 4 Years. It's an Amazon exclusive. You can find it on Amazon Music. If you want to hear original reporting, which I know so many of you do from the comments I get on social media, you need to check out this podcast because Eugene gets people that are right in the middle of everything, the way only a Washington Post reporter can. So it's really great. So Eugene, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Jessica, when we first talked with you after you were elected to office, a lot of hope, a lot of, optimism. But first of all, give us those issues that now that you're in office, you're seeing are number 1, 2, and 3 on your list of what needs to change.
Well, I think underneath it all, we need to make sure we're bringing in the revenue. This pandemic has decimated our country, our city, and our state. And as a state legislator, we have an obligation to ensure that we have the resources to take care of every single New Yorker. So it's going to take money and it's going to take those resources. So I would say top of that priority list is to tax the rich and make sure we're bringing in the revenue. I just want to underscore that 120 billionaires with a B have gotten $77 billion richer during the pandemic, just during this period. So we have to ensure that they're doing their due diligence, that they're digging a little bit deeper so that every single New Yorker has the opportunity to thrive. But the issues that you also raised just now, right? Hunger, housing, right? Making sure that everyone has the resources that they need to survive and thrive in this moment. And I would add health to that.
Zoran, what about for you in terms of, you've been a big advocate for housing, for more affordable housing. What do you see as the urgent crisis? Because there's a moratorium on evictions, but that isn't really having an effect or helping everybody. What do you see as the most urgent things right now? Like, I got to do this no matter what.
Yeah, I think that you've hit the nail on the head, which is that an eviction moratorium is in many ways a stopgap measure, right? I'm very proud of the fact that New York has passed some of the most progressive legislation with regards to a moratorium across the country, but it expires in May. And then what's going to happen? We keep kicking the can down the road, thinking that at some point someone else will solve this situation for us. But we were in fact elected to provide the solution. And what the solution is to provide New Yorkers with a fresh start. So we can stop people from getting evicted, but we have to ensure that when housing courts open back up, that there is no premise for that eviction to come back at that moment. So what that means is canceling the back rent that people owe across New York and ensuring that we provide small landlords with the relief that they need. And as Jessica said, the only way we can take those kinds of measures is if we pass revenue raisers across the state, because we talk about ourselves as New Yorkers as a progressive people, as a progressive state. We have a tax system that's regressive. It's the opposite of what we say we are. And there's $50 billion at the very least that is waiting to come into our state's coffers that could pay for these kinds of very necessary needs.
All right, we're going to talk about that. Eugene Scott, political reporter for the Washington Post and host of the podcast The Next 4 Years. Mm-hmm. Even in the time that you've been doing the podcast, you have had to change and readjust your weekly topics and focus because so much has been going on. There was a lot of hope, as you know, with the new administration, the election of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, that, okay, wow, we can finally deal with some of these issues, these criminal justice, the inequalities, the racial disparities in so many areas of American life. And yet now we're in the middle of this, what seems to so many people as almost a continual upheaval. What do you think that's going to do to the hopes for this new administration to really tackle these urgent daily problems that Americans are facing?
Well, when I speak with voters, hope remains, but I think everyone realizes that the administration is going to be a bit distracted. So many of the issues that voters were motivated to turn out and show up for and support Biden, there's still hope that he will prioritize those. There's going to be a lot of pressure on him, particularly from the left, who turned out in numbers that were essential to his victory. But the Biden administration so far seems to be making the case that they can do multiple things at the same time, address a pandemic, address an economic downturn, and quite frankly, hold a president accountable for actions that led to the deaths of, at this point, at least 5 individuals. And so what the Biden administration is going to have to prove is that they can move forward with cleaning up the mess that has happened in the past at the same time, because the pressure is there for all of that.
So you think they're, from the Washington perspective, they're feeling that pressure, and that's why we heard Biden say, okay, look, we can do, we have to keep moving forward on 2 tracks, whatever's the urgent crisis of the day, as well as, like you said, the agenda that they were elected on.
Yeah, we've had Biden tell reporters, or officials, should I say, from the Biden administration tell reporters and other lawmakers that there is concern that the first 100 days of the administration, which are very key, could be so overwhelmed and so focused on Trump and getting Trump together and in order that it can, prevent the Biden administration from doing what it is that they've promised so many Americans that they will be able to do. But many of the voters on the left have no desire to see the administration just move on without addressing what happened, especially because there's real fear that if it's not addressed, that these things could happen again in the future. I was interviewing a new congressman from New York, Mondaire Jones, and he said the message has to be sent to the Republican Party as a whole that no future Donald Trumps will be tolerated. So there are ways that you have to go about doing that. And that's why there's some pressure on the Senate, should I say, to do whatever they can to make sure that Donald Trump can't run again in 2024, or to keep other, Trump minute lights or people influenced by the president from moving forward with this agenda that you all know firsthand has been so divisive and unpopular with many Americans.
We have much more coming up. Stay with us. Jessica, when did you really first think that the hunger crisis, this food crisis, was different than it has been in the past? Because we've always had food insecurity, unfortunately, in New York City, especially in certain communities, or economically challenged communities, and for a lot of kids and for the homeless population. But when did you come to realize and say, wait a minute, this is like on a whole nother level?
Yeah, my district is the epicenter of the epicenter. I include the neighborhoods of Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona, and Woodside. Elmhurst Hospital is just down the street. Ambulance felt like the soundtrack of my campaign. And we were literally in the midst of campaigning when the pandemic broke. And immediately we shifted from in-person door knocking and engaging with folks in the community to call banking. And call banking became different. It wasn't like, hey, I'm a candidate, vote for me. It was like, how are you? Are you okay? So it was very, very evident very early that food insecurity emerged as one of the top needs in our community. Between elders that were unable to leave their homes to access grocery store. Back then, it was, mid-March when they were limiting the number of people in grocery stores. So to go shopping, you had to expose yourself to the elements, wait outside, often for hours to get inside. So there were elders not even willing or able to take that risk. And then also younger people, healthier people in the household that actually didn't want to go out and expose themselves to bring home. And then the poverty rate is really high here. We have a large immigrant community that has gotten zero relief from any form of government. So they have often worked through the pandemic at the front lines in order to put food on their table. But because I volunteer at a food pantry every single Friday, I see the lines getting longer and longer and longer. So it was heartbreaking. It was very, very evident early in the pandemic. But again, I think what the coronavirus did was actually shine a spotlight on the inequities that already existed. So it was just heightened. But we saw that very quickly. We acted very quickly. But we need to solve this at a systemic level. I feel good that I'm able to help people, that I'm able to hand them a box of food every week, that we're able to provide the support. But those are Band-Aid solutions. And we need real systemic change to ensure that everyone can put food on their table right now.
Zoran, what about for you with the with a hunger crisis? How did you see it manifest and grow into what it is now?
Yeah, I mean, it's there are just different moments from these last few months that will never leave my memory. And one of them is, in our office, we had a more than 2,000 square foot office that we rented on Steinway in the heart of Astoria. And then the pandemic hit, and obviously we shut down the office, and we ended up using it to house a food pantry that was started by a brilliant woman named Michaela Sears and now run by her and another amazing organizer named Katie Fireman. The two of them run this pantry called the Astoria Food Pantry, and they would distribute and continue to distribute food every Friday morning. And the one image that I will never forget is when I was coming by the office on Thursday around midnight, and there were already families lined up to get food 9 hours later. And that is a reality that has been people's lives for the last few months. And I also appreciate, Lisa, what you said at the beginning of this, which is that food insecurity is not something that's new to our city or our country for that matter. One of the many problems we have, though, is we have a tendency to view structural failures as personal ones. And so when people cannot afford food, we have this idea that it is their fault, that they have done something wrong. But really, the only people who have failed us are not people at all. It is the institution of our government.
Eugene, in terms of the national hunger crisis, we've seen so many reports over the last year of people waiting online for hours to get a spot. People who had never, taken, I've interviewed them in different stories too. It's like men and women saying, I've never accepted what they considered a handout in my life, but I have to feed my family. I have no other choice. What do you see happening with that? And when did you realize it was just, this is something totally different?
Yeah, what comes to mind first is a study that came out, I believe, in October from Columbia University in New York that said 8 million people slipped into poverty during this pandemic. And one of the things that I find really important to pay attention to, which I'm sure the lawmakers on the panel definitely resonate with, is when we think about poverty, that's like a specific definition and a specific income level. But if you make $1 more than that, you're not being counted in that number, right, but you're obviously still struggling. And so the number is definitely far more than 8 million. And one of the reasons why we saw so many working class voters and barely middle class voters back the Biden-Harris campaign in 2020 is because they felt like the current administration was often talking about just how well the economy was recovering and how well people's 401ks were doing. And they just didn't resonate with that. And so the impetus for this new administration to address this poverty crisis that we're seeing is going to be high.
Dorian, should hunger, housing, and education, should the solutions to those all be basic human rights?
Absolutely. I think that anything that is required to live a dignified life should be something that is guaranteed. It should not be something that is determined by the market, whether or not you can afford it. I mean, we're talking about, do people deserve to live in a frank sense, right? Do people deserve to have a place to sleep, have food to eat, have schools to send their children to? I fundamentally don't believe that anyone should be priced out of any of those things. And I think that we have to make sure that when we talk about this, it's not just as a slogan, but that we legislate in that way so that these issues become public goods.
Jessica, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think those things are human rights. I will add healthcare as a healthcare activist and advocate. I think we all must be healthy, right? But all those issues are actually intertwined, right? You can't be healthy if you don't have shelter, if you don't have access to quality education, if you don't have access to good jobs. All these things are intertwined and intersectional. And I believe it's all a human right, and we have to fight to ensure that we're investing the resources so everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Eugene, what about this? Because the concept of human rights really, I think, expanded during 2020 when people were looking at healthcare. They were looking at equal justice under the law. We saw the George Floyd tragedy. We saw Black Lives Matter raising awareness about injustices with policing and law enforcement and the criminal justice system, the hunger, all of these issues that people are having. How do you think we really need to be looking at human rights right now?
I would say that it has expanded as far as what perhaps the Democratic Party would consider a human right. But the idea that healthcare and housing are fundamental human rights goes back for decades, if not centuries. And what we have seen is, the Democratic Party move left on this issue because so many of the people who voted Democratic are asking, why is healthcare tied to employment? Like, they don't understand why that makes sense and have not been presented with solutions, or should I say an explanation for why it has to be the way it has been. And so what this has done is it's put Republicans and more conservative Democrats in a position to make the argument for why housing and why education and why healthcare aren't human rights. And I think in this current political climate, that's going to be a really hard argument to make. Because so many people understand that the way and what's perhaps necessary to live a quality life requires housing, requires food, requires solid education. And so this certainly suggests that there has been a pivot over the last maybe two years. I would argue 2018, the midterms was probably when we started seeing more people on Capitol Hill in response, perhaps to the 2016 campaign of Bernie Sanders, say we have to rethink what we consider to be fundamental human rights.
Jessica, do you think are there generational differences in how people view this, or is it more dependent on what their circumstances are?
I think it's actually a vision of the world, and there's a theory that if you believe in abundance, if you believe there's enough for everybody, if you believe in a more matriarchal society, right, you will lean left, you will lean more progressive, you will lean to make sure that we're providing those resources.
Jessica, final word on, are you hopeful?
I've been spending my career doing organizing and power building, and I did some work in South Texas where the idea of innate human right, that transcends borders, was very, very powerful for the Latinas, the immigrants that I work with on the ground. And I think about that as I enter this new job, right? It's not like my organizing, my advocacy is of the past, it's just manifests in a different way. And to see the energy and the groundswell and the accountability in which communities are holding, because they recognize that these rights are innate, right? They recognize that they deserve more than what we were given, is really, really powerful. So I always say I'm working alongside a community as opposed to voicing, somehow a voiceless community. We all have voices, right? And I believe on lifting up those voices and to see the power that's been built in the city, in the state, across the country gives me tremendous hope.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on hunger, housing, and hope. You can watch it again and catch up on all of our episodes on our Fox 5 NY YouTube page. Remember, use your mind. It's your best weapon. I'm Lisa Evers. Let's push for peace, love, and justice for all.